Welcome to the Telegraph's Business of Sport conference, which is run in conjunction with our partner BT and our sponsors Standard Life Investments, Supernor and Populous. If you were here yesterday, you will know that you are in for a day of really fascinating insights into the business of sport. We learnt so much yesterday. It was brilliant. Part of it was due to the fact that everyone got involved. And that's what I want you to do. Make sure that you ask questions of our panelists. We have some real experts here today. We've got representatives of UEFA, the Jockey Club, HSBC, McLaren, Lotus, and Robbie Savage. So that is a group of people who you really should be getting engaged with. And what we'll do is we'll hand a microphone around to people. Put your hand up, we'll send a microphone to you. The important thing is wait until the microphone arrives because it's all being recorded and your words won't be recorded if you start your question before the mic arrives. A couple of other little bits of housekeeping before we start. Please feel free to tweet during this if you hear anything. It's all on the record. Get it out there to your followers. Use the hashtag TelegraphBOS if you are doing. But if you could keep your phones on silent, that would be great. It will reduce the number of disturbances that we get. We've all heard the fire alarm. If we hear it again, it really is a fire. So just head to the green signs, get out. There's an assembly point which is located on the BT Centre side of St Paul's Cathedral by the Chapter House and Cafe Paul. There are instructions in your conference book. Ladies and gentlemen, we were going to hear from my colleague Henry Winter to start with. Henry, you may have noticed, if you picked up your copy of Telegraph Sport this morning, was in Madrid last night, where he was reporting on Madrid's failure to reach the Champions League in his normal, excellent manner. A beautiful match report in this morning's Telegraph. Unfortunately, Madrid's failure to reach the Champions League was reflected in their air traffic control. His plane was delayed, so he's not now going to be able to make it. He will be here this afternoon for his session on digital media and how we can all embrace that in the future. So we're going to start with a session about sports broadcasting. And the theme is new competition as threat and opportunity. And we have, if you were going to talk about sports broadcasting, you could not have a better panel than we have assembled today. So I'd like you to welcome on stage John Petter, the CEO of BT Consumer Division, Barbara Slater, the Director of Sport from the BBC, and Niall Sloan, the Director of Sport from ITV. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your panel. Niall, I'm barely going to give you time to open that bottle of water. Competition's a bad thing for you, isn't it?
No, it's not really. I just think the sport broadcasting landscape's been transformed in the last 20 years. I think it's been a fantastic thing for the British public. It's been a great thing for different broadcasters. I was thinking back this morning to 1992 when I was at the BBC, and there was a huge debate about the Premier League, and it became clear that we were being offered the return of Match of the Day. And it was an interesting one at the time. Barbara will remember it as well. It was, I think, the corporation's sports department was split down the middle. Do we get into bed with Sky, or do we sit on the sidelines and do something else? And the corporation took the decision then to go into a relationship with Sky for the return of Match of the Day. They got all the live over the 5 years, and Match of the Day returned. Now, I remember speaking to Alan Sugar about several years after that, and he said the whole Premier League deal would not have worked for Sky without the BBC's presence there. Match of the Day remains a very, very strong brand. So those relationships, those different ways of looking at things, forced by the entrance of Sky into the market, has made everybody reevaluate. And I think it's meant for a very rich and diverse set of coverage throughout the British landscape. And I think it's been nothing but good.
Barbara, nothing but good, but the average consumer is now going to pay something like £60 a month to watch football that in the past would have come from the BBC for free. If Sky hadn't come along, would the BBC be putting on the amount of football that we now see?
Well, the truth is the BBC and across its main networks is mixed genre. So, you know, the fact is there is a volume of sport that the BBC couldn't provide. It just doesn't have the capacity to do so. And I would just pick up from Niall and say that I think what you've seen over a period of time is an ecology that actually has got a number of different broadcasters playing their part, and actually that has delivered for audiences a fantastic breadth, range, volume and choice that they wouldn't have had before. So I would say competition is healthy, but it's a delicate balance, and I think it's important that a mix of broadcasters all play their part, and that some effectively are not priced out. But for week in, week out coverage, I think what satellite television has brought has been, you know, a volume that your terrestrial would struggle to provide.
John, if we had Richard Scudamore on this panel, he would certainly be rubbing his hands about the competition that broadcasters have brought, because he's been the main beneficiary. You paid way too much for the rights for Premier League football, didn't you?
Well, I think the main beneficiaries of the launch of BT Sport has actually been football fans, in fact, because Sky has been historically the source of innovation and competition, but that's a long time in the past now. And so what you can see, if you compare the UK to other countries, is that take-up of premium sport in this country is still actually relatively very, very low. And it's because of the high prices that Barbara was talking about. So for BT Sport, and the goal that we had was to try and, in some ways, give sport back to the people to a much lower entry threshold price point. And you can see that we've done that, because there are roughly sort of 2 million people, 4 million 2 million households, 4 million people, I should say, who didn't subscribe to Sky that's subscribed to BT Sport now. So the competition's therefore got far greater breadth, basically, as a consequence of BT Sport's entry. And there's a difference in the sort of people who are subscribing to BT Sport. They are younger, typically. They're not necessarily so well off. There are more of them in the nations of the United Kingdom, more in Scotland, more in Wales, and more in Northern Ireland too, so there's a difference there as well. And BT Sport's been a source of innovation, in fact, too, not just through the pricing model, but through the way we've depicted our sport on the screen, things like picture-in-picture. And I think the interesting thing is that we've sort of prompted Sky to change what they do a bit too, and again, the beneficiary of that is the football fan, because Sky, for example, have changed some of their coverage. The first season BT Sport launched, Sky did their first Premier League games free. I think the first one was Swansea Man U on the 17th of August 2013. Then last season they did 7 Champions League games broadcast simultaneously on Sky One as well. So we're forcing them to think about their model too. The beneficiary is the football fan.
But Barbara, you have to every year come up with, or every 3 years, whatever the cycle is, more money to show football on the BBC. The BBC's funds have been frozen for the past century or however long it has been. How do you manage that?
And might I add, it's not just football. I mean, we have a period of superinflation in sports rights, and that makes it incredibly challenging. So there's no doubt about that. I think the other thing that's happening too is you're seeing much more competition in terms of what a broadcaster has to do to acquire rights. Yes, there's a huge financial investment, of course, but actually there's an awful lot more. So when when you're pitching for rights, I think the surround sound, and certainly something that we would be saying to a rights holder as we would be pointing to audience reach. I don't think this is just in the hand of the broadcaster. I think it's in the hands of the rights holders as well. They have trade-offs to make. So we would make a very rounded case part financial, of course, but part the reach, the surround sound, the amplification that a terrestrial broadcaster can bring. So yes, we're seeing superinflation, but I think a rights holder is becoming more demanding in what else they're seeking from their partners.
Now, superinflation, how have you reacted as the terrestrial commercial channel?
Well, badly when the superinflation of BT in the Champions League came around, I suspect. I think that it's not just a broadcaster's responsibility for what they want to do with the sport that they buy. It's the rights holders and the federations. They've got to work out, as Barbara suggested, that what's the best ecology, what's the best mix of rights, what's the best split between pay and free. Is it highlights only in free, or is it some live? And I think that is developing slowly. I think we've had 20 years where, with the subscription models, a lot of rights holders said there's an enormous amount of money here, let's just take it and move it to a smaller number of people who are able to pay that money. I think it's developing slowly into a different kind of mix in a new era, strangely, that there's two huge competitors. But I think some federations are working out that they need more eyeballs on the sport if they're going to develop it. And I think that's the interesting thing for the next 5 or 6 years.
So who, in your opinion, has got it wrong in the past? Which sports have blown it in terms of you need the terrestrial television coverage to evangelise your sport, but you need the satellite to give you the money to keep it going? Well,
I think it's fair to say that a current crop of boxers, if they walked down any high street in the UK, would be untroubled by people recognising them. And I think that's bad for boxing because you do need heroes and recognition and for kids wanting to follow that path.
So the bank managers recognise them.
Yeah, and that's the trade-off. But that's the trade-off with the people who trade boxing rights. I think there's an appetite certainly within ITV for boxing, but you have to look at the model and each individual proposition that comes forward. And I've been in ITV 6.5 years. And it's very rarely you get an offer from a boxing promoter or manager. You think, do you know what? That'll be good for both of us. It tends to be only one way. But it's a sport we look at. I'm sure John and the boys are looking at it in greater depth. But at the moment, I think that sport needs a new model.
John, just give us an idea of when you were deciding to pitch for the rights to show the Premier League. What was it that you thought needed to be done by a broadcaster that wasn't being done already?
Well, we did see an opportunity because the prospect of paying £60 or £70 a month, that does exclude some people. And so we saw that if you look at the US, for example, the take-up of a channel like ESPN there is extremely high. It's about 80% of households typically have it. And if you do any kind of consumer survey in the UK, kind of 50% of people have some interest in sport, it's clear, but only 1 in 5 people subscribe to Sky Sports typically. So therefore there was a clear market opportunity. And I'm just picking up on your earlier comment, sport is paying off very well for our business. I mean, this time last week, I was on this stage for BT's results, and the consumer division's results we're pretty pleased with in total. I mean, our profit's up 24% in total for the year. Our revenue for the year is up 7%. Consistent story of top and bottom line growth. So we see that the BT strategy, it was certainly quite risky in some ways, and perhaps riskier than we knew at the time, actually. But the risk has paid off because there is a clear market opportunity, and the appeal of sport is very, very broad and was being underserved.
Barbara, how do you argue the case within the BBC? Because presumably the great argument is going on now within your colleagues. Look, Sky, BT, ITV, let them have it. We can't afford to be in that game anymore. How often does that come up in discussions at W1A?
Oh, I think there is an absolute acknowledgement about the importance of sport,
What, even with your top governors?
Yes, reaching the widest possible audience. It's absolutely right that the BBC needs to be seeking to provide coverage for all sorts of different audience groups, and sport delivers. to many, many actually of the audience that otherwise the BBC slightly struggles to reach. So there's no question, sport matters. Actually, the BBC makes a huge investment in sport, and I know it's maybe less than our paid partners and considerably less. But actually, events like the Olympics, the Wimbledons, etc., there is a recognition of the BBC's core purpose around showing moments that everybody can share in. And those are incredibly important, unifying moments where people gather, contributing to, frankly, the nation's conversation around some of those biggest occasions. And whereas we might not be able to afford all of those, it's certainly an ambition to continue to provide those moments.
And what about, sorry, John?
Just to come in, that I think it doesn't have to be completely binary, completely free or completely pay. And so the model that we have actually welcomes free as part of the mix.
And I was going to say that what was interesting is the FA.
Yes.
Where actually there was a joint BT and BBC bid, and as part of those conversations it was for each of those two organisations to bring to the mix, and the pitch that we made to the FA, the benefits of both of those organisations. So some of the marketing investment that BT could make against some of the audience reach, and there was a collective desire between those three parties around what could be done to grow, amplify. You know, the FA Cup, it's the nation's favourite cup competition. To rekindle that, to make it the great occasion that it has been, by the way, in the past, and hopefully will be in the future.
And the reach of that competition is about 23% up year on year, so that's definitely reaching more people. And what you've seen from both organisations is very much a different approach or way of working. So, for example, some of the clips on the BBC website feature BT Sport talent, and we are delighted with that. It just increases their reach.
I think to follow on that, and I think the other thing that's been really interesting about that partnership is that the fact is we've gone, all of the content is shareable by both broadcaster, and actually that's enabled us to exploit content in ways that we haven't done in the past, and really reach FA Cup content right through other programming across the BBC. And actually I think the beneficiary of that has been the FA Cup. You know, we've even now got in some of the educational programmes, you know, guides to some mathematical equations illustrated with the FA Cup, just taking that output to constantly new and wider audiences.
No, give us an insight without giving away any secrets of this. When you go into a negotiation with, for instance, UEFA about the Champions League, are they interested in, you know, stuff about whether you can spread their word, or is it just the money they want?
Well, I wouldn't want to lay this answer at UEFA's door as a specific. I think in general, the more far-sighted federations and rights holders do see beyond the money. But for all you can argue about what you can do with that and what free-to-air can bring, ultimately the people who run those organisations are answerable to a board somewhere who, by and large, want to see a lot more money on the table. So ultimately, the single most important thing in a rights negotiation is generally money at the upper level. We do a lot of sport on ITV4, and you'll see sports in there which, like the French Open and the Tour de France, they tend not to put huge priority on money. The Tour de France guys were offered a lot more money than we were providing. But what ITV, the main channel, and ITV4 were bringing was a greater recognition of the brand and the mark of the Roland Garros. So it tends to work primarily about money at the top level, but as you slightly go down the scale of the rights and the importance of them, there are other considerations come into play, and those two that I've mentioned, they happen both to be French organisations, but we have benefited enormously from it, and the relationship is very, very good.
Barbara?
I was going to say, I'll slightly take issue with Barbara about how important sport is to the BBC. We were both in the place a long time, and again, around 2000, I remember being at a do where one of the blue stocking ladies of the BBC said to me, we've discovered sport's really important to the retention of the licence fee. And I was with Trevor Brooking, who, as everybody knows, is a very mild-mannered, very respectful guy, and he got really angry. He said, it's taken you this long to work out how important sport is. And I think BBC suffered from that in the 90s, And that attitude, and I still think, Bob may tell me different, but I still think there's an attitude at the very top level of the BBC that sport's a little bit too far down the pecking order of things they need to do.
Defend yourself, Barbara.
It's not defending itself, it's the organisation.
I'm just, you know, if you look at that, the spend on sport, and you look at the spend on sport over now, what's a pretty extended period of time, as a percentage of the licence fee, that's remained pretty static. And actually, we've also won rights back. So I mean, the FA Cup is a case in point. So I'm not going to pretend that this isn't going to be tough, you know, particularly depending on where the licence fee goes. And certainly we've had a period of time where we have had to save really significant sums of money. We've had to take 20% out of everything that we do. That has an on-screen cost. You can't take that amount out. And of course, there have been some rights that we've lost too as a consequence of that. But I firmly believe that there is a recognition at the top of the organisation about the value of sport in providing those moments that unite the nation. And they're incredibly precious, and they're incredibly important, and incredibly important that they're shared.
One of the things that you talked about before that the BBC delivered quite spectacularly in 2012 was the Olympic Games. Every year the BBC does a great job on Wimbledon. These are listed events. I'm just interested from John, how much does that distort competition? Should it be free? Should you be able to bid for everything?
I don't think we'd take issue with the notion of listed events. I think, as Barbara was saying, the nation needs to have some things that are symbols of unity. And actually, many of them wouldn't be great subscription properties anyway, because they're single one-off major national events. And subscription...
Well, you have pay-per-view for Mayweather against Pacquiao. Why couldn't you have pay-per-view for the Olympics 100-metre final?
You could, but pay-per-view is not my model, personally. BT's model is a subscription model, albeit in many cases a free subscription. I'm not saying you couldn't do it. You could do it, but personally, I think that there is merit in the notion of listed events.
No, would you agree?
Well, going back to your Mayweather-Pacquiao example, I don't have any issue with a fight at that level being pay-per-view, but I think it'd be slightly more far-sighted if the broadcaster owns the pay-per-view rights were to release them to free-to-air at a sensible time afterwards, so other people can join in the conversation. How many people will watch? I haven't seen the figures, but I doubt it's more than 1 million. Well, that's a hell of a lot of the UK population who are interested in boxing won't have a chance to see the fight. And it's that kind of mixed ecology I think would benefit everybody. It would benefit Sky ultimately, because if you show how great these fighters are, if there's a rematch, more people might come to the pay-per-view.
So why is that not happening? Is that the broadcaster's fault?
You'll need to ask the broadcaster of that event.
Is it the broadcaster who's digging their heels in,
yeah,
or is it the sports themselves, John?
Well, I sort of think that the Sky model is clearly a very effective model that's worked for a long period of time, but the sums involved in bidding for rights in the way that they have put such pressure on the business model that the notion of kind of making short, long-term trade-offs and to make stuff free to broaden their appeal, it's difficult for them to do that. And certainly we have a different approach to how we bid for things, in that we very much look for sustainability in the business model and try and drive the whole thing as much through customer insight and market research as we can. And you have to, if you take that view, you have to be prepared to lose things as well. And that's uncomfortable, and no one likes being in that position. But ultimately, I think it's a better approach.
We were talking yesterday, it was a couple of people from the audience were asking, how do other sports get a little bit of light when Premier League casts such a shadow over everything? Let's talk about the competition between different sports. You seem to be, in broadcasting, so driven by the need to get the Premier League, to get football on, that are other sports being damaged as a result? No.
I think it took other sports a long time to work out what the Premier League had become, and by the end of the 90s there was already football, and then there was sport, and there were two different universes. And rugby going professional towards the end of the 90s, I think they made the mistake of thinking they could approach the level of income, of promotion that the Premier League was already beginning to build up. And I think it took them a while to readjust. And I think everybody had to work out, you'll never become like football in this country. You'll never become what the Premier League has become. So therefore, you have to work out what's the next level. And I think it's for sports then to work that out. What do they want to become at that level? What can they point out that's unique? And I think rugby's come a long way in doing that. And building up the unique brand that rugby has and its own specific attractions. And I think other organisations need to work out what is unique and different to our sport, and then extol its virtues and try and sell it into the broadcasters on that level. Don't pretend you're something that you're not.
Well, I would say, I think genuinely this is a space where I think the BBC makes a really valuable contribution. The breadth and range of sport. If you just look back over the last few weekends, you'll see an extraordinary range of both niche interest and you might say mainstream events, things like the London Marathon, Badminton horse trials. I mean, there is a huge rich mix if you look, and you also take into consideration some of the digital platforms as well. I mean, it might surprise people, but 25% of BBC Sport output is across the whole of the Olympic family. So those sort of 26 sports, of course, every individual one of those 26 sports would love more time. But actually, in terms of breadth and range, we see that as a really important role that we play. So we are less dominated by football. That's not to say football isn't incredibly important and isn't a massive driver of what we do through both the major events, the FA Cup, Premier League highlights, and all that we do across 5 Live Radio and the website too. Football is a massive driver of those audiences, no doubt.
Give us an idea of comparative audience then. How many people watch the boat race in comparison to how many people watch Match of the Day?
Well, the boat race this time, I think it was tipping up to 5 million for the women's race, which was fantastic to see that on the Tideway for the first time. And the men's race was 6.5 million. Fantastic figures. A Match of the Day highlights is for 4.5 million. We have had audiences for Match of the Day of over 5 when it's been a particularly strong day's play with lots of goals. So what I think is remarkable actually is a highlights format that many might have predicted the demise of, actually in the shape of Match of the Day, has stood the test of time in a most extraordinary fashion actually.
What do you get for a Champions League game involving Chelsea? Does it depend? Chelsea, Man United, Barcelona?
Pre-Christmas, it's about 3.5 million. An English team going forward in the knockout phase will do 6 or 7. Real Madrid, Manchester United, Real Madrid 2 seasons ago did 11.5 million. There's a curiosity. The Champions League final was always held on a Wednesday, but Platini decided to move it to a Saturday night, and the figures have gone down. So the scheduling is quite important. At the BBC, we kind of invented the 5:15 kickoff about 2000, something like that, maybe before that. Yeah. And there was a huge number. We thought this game, Southampton versus Spurs, wouldn't do a lot outside the M25, but it returned about 7 million. So it plays into that thing. Can sports be flexible with the scheduling to fit in with other people's busy lives? The FA Cup moved from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock for all kinds of reasons. And, we did the demographic survey, and a lot of people are in garden centres and supermarkets on Saturday at 3 o'clock. And you have to fit in a lot to what people's lives has become. There was a famous argument within the BBC that, I'll paraphrase, while there's an opening in my posterior, the FA Cup final will kick off at 3. And oddly enough, it now kicks off at 5. And a lot more people are a lot...
What happened to that
opening? And he's still got his body intact. And there's, a lot more people come to the FA Cup final now because of that. Now, everybody says, the traditionalist argument is it's 3 o'clock. That's fine, but that does not fit into how people live their lives. And you have to adjust.
What about the fans who live their lives, who are travelling down to watch matches that are now scheduled at 5 o'clock on a Sunday?
There are a lot of train lines And if you speak to the train companies, are they unable to run trains at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock at night? That surely must be solvable. The Premier League has done 4 o'clock matches on Sundays for a long time. These problems are surmountable.
Yeah, and there are trade-offs, aren't there? I mean, I'm just thinking of some of that, you know, fabulous Six Nations rugby played on a Friday night. And we know that there are many, many challenges around that. But the fact is that delivered a 9 million audience for that sport. That's an incredibly precious thing. If you are trying to look after that long-term sustainability, the interest, putting your sport out in front of a really wide audience, the health of those numbers coming, you know, putting that fantastic international rugby absolutely on a par with top international football, there's a value to that. And yes, there may be challenges for the fans and for the sport in organising that, but those are some of the trade-offs that a governing body is going to have to decide on.
We heard yesterday from the people involved in Rugby World Cup 2015. That's going to be on your channel, Niall. Do you, when you have negotiations with them about things, are you at the foremost? Are they talking about reach and about evangelism? Yeah,
I think rugby is a very you know, forward-looking sport across the various platforms, whether it's the RFU or World Rugby. And remember, you know, organising a Rugby World Cup in England doesn't come around that often. The next one's in Japan, you know, which will be early starts. That's got its own challenge. And we think 2023 will be, you know, in a relatively benign time zone for Europe. So it's been different, you know, arguing about the kickoffs for this one with them. And it was a relatively smooth process because they understand our need to maximise audiences. And, you know, a big event like that does have its challenges, but when it's in Japan, you've got no real argument. You can't say, can you shift it a bit later? So the people of Japan are disadvantaged. So Rugby World Cup's a fantastic opportunity for the sport in this country. And I've had sort of 7 or 8 different bodies come to me and say, how can we get our message across within ITV's coverage? But that's a prime example, because we'll have so many eyeballs for that 6-week period. Rugby's got a real chance to evangelise and spread the word and get people into grassroots forms of the sport.
Part of the competition about broadcasting is the way it's delivered. And rugby has been delivered brilliantly by Sky. It's been delivered brilliantly by BT. Has rugby said to you, look, ITV, you've got to raise your game up to those levels, or is that something you naturally do?
No, but I think I worked on the first Rugby World Cup for the BBC in 1987. It's been on ITV ever since, and it's been broadcast bloody well, you know, in those 4-year periods. Yes, of course, we don't do live rugby week in, week out, but that's fine. We have a very talented pool of directors. You know, we've got a very strong presentation lineup. So I've got no qualms whatsoever about our ability to do it. Yes, the Federation obviously wants the best possible coverage, but because of our track record down the years, I don't think they're too fearful about it.
John, do you look at the Rugby World Cup and think, I wish we had that, we could do it a lot better?
I certainly don't think that, actually, and I'm sure Niall's going to do it brilliantly, actually. I think, in fact, there is some sharing of talent between us, and therefore I'm very confident it's going to be a success. Going back to what I was saying, kind of one-off competitions that last a few weeks are not great subscription kind of business model drivers, but they do create huge interest in the sport. I think that rugby's one of the things that BT Sport has sort of done well on generally, and our coverage on rugby's been a success because we felt there was still an opportunity, that Sky had been very much the innovators around football. I think that we've competed well with them on football, but on rugby, there was the opportunity to really to pull ahead substantially, and I actually believe we have done that. And the quality of the presenters and the way we've told the story of the club competitions, it helps, I think, in some ways, to have had the whole narrative of the Aviva Premiership on one channel, because previously it was split between Sky and ESPN and was kind of disjointed. And I think there's a bit of a theme here that where rights are to be shared, in everyone's interest, it kind of makes sense for broadcasters to try and collaborate to ensure that the whole story of the sport is told properly to the viewer, in the way the BBC and can BT Sport have for the FA Cup? You know, that's a model for what you can do.
Barbara, the joke about Sky, and we can make it because they're not represented here, is that if they haven't got the rights to a sport, it doesn't exist. How are you going to approach the Rugby World Cup at the BBC?
Oh, we will report on it. We've of course
with,
got
with your
got
fingers
radio,
on your nose? Or?
No, not at all. We've got the radio rights. We will embrace it across our digital online services, and I think it's one of the reasons why those services have such extraordinary reach. I mean, just over the last 3 months since Christmas, we've now exceeded those extraordinary figures in 2012. So just last Saturday, 8.7 million people came in a single day to get their news, information, reportage from the sport website. 12 million globally, and that's because we absolutely will tell the story straight, not with a bias.
I'm going to throw this open to you. So if we could prepare a question, I'm just going to throw one final thought at the panel, and then I'm going to open it out to you. I was at Chelsea the other day, and at the back of the East Stand, I saw the most remarkable thing I've ever seen at a football match in the last 10 years. They had a row of Xbox computer terminals, and you could play on those a game of FIFA. Kids were playing on those panels while the match was going on. Not only were they playing on those panels, other kids were watching them playing. So they were playing FIFA while behind them there was the Premier League champions in action. Now, you could say that's a reflection of how boring Chelsea are, but that's another thing. Competition is now beyond just the three of you fighting over rights, isn't it? How are you approaching that sort of competition from the other screens, John?
Sorry, I was just going to say that plays into, when you talk to federations, they have to take note of how people's lives are. Yeah. You can't just, there's a static, audience there all the time who will come in for that, and, their lives revolve around that event. They don't. They've got their own lives to lead, and there's a lot more opportunities to do whatever, whether it's a garden centre, whether it's a PlayStation. Those are important to them. So where's the sport fit in? You have to have those conversations.
I mean, the e-games phenomenon is huge, and it's predicted to grow enormously. I mean, I think there are some extraordinary figures. Over 50% of all streamed video on the internet is e-games. I mean, there are individual gamers who have followers, and they are up to double digits in terms of millions of followers. It's extraordinary. And I think the other thing that's really interesting about the e-games as well is the length of time. So people are consuming or involved for over 20 hours a week. So both an extraordinary trajectory of increase, but also actually when people are involved in that, the amount of time they're investing. And you're now seeing the creation of stadia around e-games. Oh, absolutely, seriously, particularly in Asia and Korea. I mean, huge. One of the FIFA 2002 stadia, that scale of stadia, packed, watching people with their e-games on giant screens. So it's
a
huge.
Stone throw from the East Stand, in Fulham Broadway Station, there's a View Cinema. They've taken out 2 of the cinema screens, and that's now, those 2 cinemas now just dedicated to e-games.
I think, though, as sports broadcasters, we shouldn't be afraid of the technology, but should embrace it. And I've got a sort of a comparable story to yours that should give us, I think, some hope, and that is that I went to the NBA game at the Millennium Dome. At the time the NBA came to London, obviously, and we filmed that game in 4K. And we were in a box, basically, and there was a balcony on the front of the box, and everyone started the game sitting in the balcony watching the game. We had a gigantic 4K screen at the back of the box, which gave you a very complete view of the court. And over the course of the night, people actually migrated from the balcony where they were watching the game to inside where they were watching the screen, which is completely bizarre. And the sport looked so fantastic in 4K, and you got such a complete view that, in a way, you actually got closer to the action through that means. And I sort of think that should give us some hope. And there are loads more examples. So, for example, our coverage of MotoGP, what we find is massive take-up of second screen in the context of that. So this season, the British riders have had a camera on their bikes. And kind of MotoGP is, in my view, a perfect sport for television because it's noisy and colourful, and you can almost kind of smell it and sense it. Mm-hmm. But seeing it on the bikes really just adds to the excitement. So I think technology can make what we do so much better and can help us compete with the garden centre and win. And that's what we have to do. Yeah.
I don't know how many people have seen 4K. But it is astonishing. The curious
What is 4K? Just go, what is it?
It's super definition.
Yeah.
But did you see 8K at the World Cup?
I've seen the 8K, yeah.
It's worse than 4K, which is counterintuitive, but it was.
You need to get really close to the screen, and then it's unbelievable. I mean, you can pick out faces in the crowd in the sort of 25th row. I mean, the detail, it's extraordinary. And it'll probably change some of the dynamics of TV coverage, actually, because you don't need to start cutting all the time. Yeah. Actually, when you've got this extraordinary view, and what's interesting is because of the amount of data within the picture, you know, this notion of, well, I'll just zoom in there, and well, I'll have a little look in there. And I mean, what the potential for a next generation of coverage and virtual technology as well. I mean, I don't know how many of you have put the helmet on, and there you are, you're in the stadium, and you can sort of walk across the field of play, and it's extraordinary. The intimacy, and I mean, talk about best seat in the house, you know, you're right in the centre of it.
So the next thing, at the back of the East Stand at Chelsea, they'll have those virtual reality things, and you can pretend that you're in a stand at a football match. Yeah. It'd be fantastic. Yeah. For goodness sake, John, don't tell Ian Ritchie of the Rugby World Cup that it's better to watch on telly than buy a ticket. Sorry, you were going to say?
I was going to say that 4K kind of gives you a view of the game, potentially, which can be similar to the view you get on FIFA Soccer. So kind of, you can get that complete view from that top angle, basically, I'm showing the whole pitch in the way that Barbara was describing. And I think so this is sports broadcasting, sports coverage, taking on board the fact that people's viewing preferences and the way they look at things on screens has really changed. So
how far away is 4K then from normal consumer television?
4K is here, basically. If you buy a TV, it'll be a 4K TV, really. And yeah.
And you're broadcasting in that?
We're not yet.
But it'll come quite quickly. I mean, look at HD and widescreen. I mean, once those... What will happen is it will move to become industry standard. Oh, I mean, what?
Get down to John Lewis and Jim, the price comes down.
We've done several test broadcasts in 4K, and we will be looking to build out 4K soon.
I mean, what I do think will happen, though, is 4K will overtake 3D. 4K will overtake 3D.
3D never really took off, did it?
It was sort of relied on sort of trickery. I don't know about others, but sometimes it could slightly make you almost feel seasick. So I think 4K will leapfrog because it's the clarity of the picture, whereas actually 3D was
3D was driven by Hollywood, running out of ideas.
And I'm sure there'll be super films that they'll do in the future that will still be in 3D. But as the industry standard for broadcast, I think it's going to be a direction of greater quality.
Just before I do throw it out, just one thing the panel wanted to make clear. They can't discuss individual rights because those are commercially sensitive. So if you were going to ask them how much they were going to bid for the next round of the Premier League, they can't actually reveal that now.
Not very much.
Gentleman there, in the middle.
Hi, John Rest from Sportcow. Next month, the European Games take place in Baku. Throughout Europe, the majority of broadcasters are either the public service broadcaster or free-to-air commercial broadcasters. In the UK, BT have them exclusively. Does that set a dangerous precedent that a multi-sports event with British fencers that don't get much coverage are going to only be seen on pay TV?
Well, I'm sure answer no. Your turn, Barbara. Yeah.
By the way, we will do some highlights of that, and I think the really interesting thing at the moment is that what is the future for competition within Europe? Because actually there is a European Championships, which will also potentially be made up of a number of the lead sports. So potentially, and I know that it's not all yet formalised and agreed, at the time of the European Athletics Championships, i.e. the A-list Athletics Championships, a host of other European Championships will be held to try and create I suppose, something that is bigger than the sum of its parts, which is very much what is the motivation behind Baku. So I think it's going to be very interesting comparing those two, because of course in Baku you've got quite a range of competition. So you've certainly got in some of the sports, it is not the elite, it's junior ranks, and I think that is quite difficult. It's a start. I think you'd have to question the standard of some of that competition, and what's interesting actually is to have both of those. What would seem to make enormous sense is that all of that comes together into a single with a very, very elite level across a range of sports, and that's not what we're seeing at the moment. Hopefully that will come though.
Barbara, without giving away commercially sensitive secrets, when Simon Clegg approached with the rights of the European Games, did you think, not sure, we were not convinced about the quality of some of the individual events. And we have a finite resource. And actually, we invest in European championships. We invest in the European Athletics Championships, the European Gymnastics Championships, the European Swimming Championships, and we were not seeing at the Games that in all of the sports, that top tier of competition. So if we were going to take away from some of our existing relationships to invest in that, I'm not sure that would have been the right thing to do.
We had the presentation as well, and it looked credible, yeah. But when you kind of burrowed underneath it, and we understood the progression from this year to the second event and how they would build on it, but it still didn't make any financial sense for us.
But we heard yesterday from a sponsor who got in very, very early with the women's boat race, and as a result got fantastic returns. Could you have thought the other way around as a broadcaster, get in early, get it cheap?
There's a big difference between Putney and Baku, I have to say, and if you fairly self-evident, but if you look at the competition, as Barbara's alluded to, we just weren't quite sure what level of sport this was.
We are investing in European Championships. Absolutely, we are, and I think that's the point. What I'm sure is there's not enough is the resources to invest in 2 European Championships.
So how did it end up with you then, John?
Well, I think what you're hearing is very interesting, because clearly these guys weren't convinced, but for BT, I think that we're turning over the perceptions that people have of premium sport as being football obsessed and to the exclusion of all other sports, and it has to be a huge price to get it. You know, it's going to be available to a great many people on BT Sport, and therefore it'll be hugely accessible. Therefore, it's not a dangerous precedent, to your point. And we are a new broadcaster, and I'm prepared to not just kind of buy established properties, but to build properties over time, because we're a new entrant. So therefore, I think that for us, it's a good opportunity to build this sport, in effect, actually, and to build this competition, and that's what we'll be trying to do.
Yeah.
Hi, Ben Rumsby from the Telegraph. The past few days appear to have been dominated by talk of the BBC licence fee. Just wondering what the panel think of the notion of the licence fee in 2015, and for Barbara, how devastating would it be to the BBC's ability to broadcast some of these unifying events that you've talked about if the licence fee was to be heavily cut under the new government?
No.
Well, I would say that the licence fee is probably the least worst solution to having a broadcaster like the BBC. I think a lot of people at ITV would support the BBC in some shape or form. I go back to what I've argued at the BBC long and hard. I argued within the BBC, I argued within the BBC, whether it's just far too much management. It's astonishing. And no matter how many people at the BBC tell you we've cut this and we've cut that, there are swathes of people doing jobs that don't need to exist, doing it in a mediocre way.
So you're not applying for the head of better then?
I was about to say,
There isn't
a head of better, by the way.
I looked long and head of better and thought somebody could do it better.
John?
I haven't worked at the BBC, so I don't have a strong view on sort of some of the points that were being made there, but I do think the BBC needs to be properly funded. I think it makes a major contribution to national life, and I kind of wish the BBC luck in making a very strong, persuasive case, and I'm sure they'll do that.
Yeah.
Barbara, Niall's view is not unusual.
Yeah.
Well, look, the fact is that there is going to be a huge debate about the BBC, what the BBC brings. The BBC is a great asset to the UK, absolutely challenges around the licence fee going forward. There is, though, a short-term agreement now that the licence fee is the most appropriate way of funding the BBC for the next cycle, and that now has been determined. So now the debate moves to the scale and the scope of the BBC, and that was always going to be the pace with charter renewal coming up at the end of 16. And that's a debate, and I would just encourage everybody to be a part of that, because actually, having had a number of years now flat licence fee, which has effectively resulted in smaller budgets for individual divisions such as sport, there is going to become a tipping point at which the BBC does need investment if it is going to continue to compete for, I think, events that people really treasure on the BBC, like the Olympics and some of the major championships. And of course, we're exploring a multitude of different solutions to that, including sharing with other broadcasters, etc. And there's still a very, very significant investment that we're currently making. But actually to see that on a significantly downward trajectory, I think would be enormously damaging to the overall ecology of sports broadcasting. I think the moment there's all of the things you were saying at the beginning, healthy competition between pay and sometimes free to air, sometimes in partnership. Actually, I think it's a delicate balance, and it would be a great loss to sports broadcasting if that balance is tipped too far in other directions.
But is the fear within your organisation that that's coming?
Well, I don't think we know, and I think that debate is being kicked off now. I mean, the mood music might not be very encouraging, but have we told the story sufficiently of the massive asset that the BBC is to the UK? Has that story really been told yet? And I hope this debate will bring that to light.
Gentleman at the front here.
Darryl Broadfoot from the Scottish Football Association. Apologies for the political question, especially with this accent. The recent renegotiation of the highlights package with BBC has borne out some strong views that there should be a more equitable split among other domestic leagues within Britain. What's your take on that, Barbara?
I mean, we've spent most of the morning talking about competition, and the sports rights market is intensely competitive, and there are all sorts of dynamics that are taken into consideration when you put together what you would bid for rights. And it is quite correct that the licence fee, we are trying to get as much as we can in terms of sports rights with the investment. So we are, to a degree, going to be dictated by the market rate. And the fact is, and I know the comparison you're going to draw between highlights of football in Scotland and highlights that we would pay for the Premier League. Truth is, the Premier League is a global brand. It is loved by audiences. And we think it's incredibly important that Match of the Day, as the highlights broadcaster of Premier League football, is an incredibly important programme for us to invest in. The message from audiences across the UK is crystal clear. They love Match of the Day, and they want Match of the Day to stay on the BBC. And I mean, I've been in this business, and Al has too, for many, many years. I think the strength of reaction we got when the BBC renewed those Match of the Day highlights this time is probably the most positive reaction that we've had to a set of sports rights, because I think there was real concerns in that current marketplace about how tough it is to secure rights. So yes, there is inequality in funds, But as a broadcaster, as someone investing the licence fee, I've got to invest it in a way that the market dictates.
One quick happy one, if that's okay, just to everyone. What opportunities and threats are posed by the Channel 5 Football League deal, both from a technology point of view, but also prime time Saturday night? Thank you.
No.
Sorry, what do you mean by threats?
Just on the basis of the panel name, the opportunities and threats that exist in terms of how that free-to-air can actually help.
Well, I think sorry. I think that's a good thing for Football League fans. Saturday night around that time, there's not a lot of other compelling sport around. I think it's a very good time to schedule that show. Depends how they want to make it. It's quite a difficult show to make at that time, but I think there's a great opportunity for Channel 5. So we have no problem with that.
Was there a question there in the middle there?
Thank you. Andy Hughes from the Grove Hotel. Is there not a fear with, yesterday we were talking about how business needs to look after sport, and there is a reduction in sort of children playing sport, that it not being open for them to watch, and we talked about sort of with BT Sport offering it to families that can't afford maybe the Sky Sport package, that actually the pipeline of people watching sport is going to disappear and they'll all be gaming in 10 years' time and there won't be any sport and the business in sport will not be existing.
That's a pessimistic thought. John?
I think there is a genuine concern underlying this, and therefore that was why we were keen to make sport a lot more affordable. And you can see this playing out in our demographics, and relative to Sky's demographics. Our viewers are younger, they're less well off, they're less in London and the South East. So kind of, I think there is a fear that, I think it's not hopefully quite as dire a scenario as you described there, but the trends here suggest there's something to be addressed, and therefore I think it's very important and that sports rights holders do invest back in the grassroots and that their broadcast partners support them in doing that, and that's what we've been doing. For example, the Premier League doesn't get enough credit, in my view, for the great work it does nourishing the grassroots of football. There's a specific initiative that BT does called the Supporters Club, and this was a thing that we started at the same time we started BT Sport. So the way it works is that customers who get BT Sport for free can choose to subscribe for £1 on their BT bill, and the £1 goes to this charity, the Supporters Club. The funds are managed by Comic Relief, and they're given to charities that promote the kind of welfare of young people through sport. And there are some amazing stories both in the UK and overseas as the work of that charity. It's been a great success. So far we've raised about £4 million. But I think we've really only scratched the surface of that opportunity, because to date only 0.9% of our customers have elected to opt in and to subscribe. So one of the things I'm focused on is in persuading the other 99% to subscribe on their bills too, because it's only £1 for heaven's sake, and you can make a huge difference through that subscription model.
I just think that's something that we take very seriously as well. I hope you're all watchers of BBC programmes. I hope you noticed at the end of every programme we finish with a Get Inspired, which is a portal, if you like, where governing bodies can register all of their participation activities. We're pushing, in an average month, maybe 700,000 people are going, and then there are links to a multitude of activities. We're working very closely with governing bodies. The People's Cup, in terms of the FA, saw participation, active participation, 30,000 people who previously had not played as part of a team. So I think it is something that actually all the broadcasters consider incredibly important, and those I think initiatives have a real contribution to make. But I would say I think the single most important thing are role models, and for those role models to be seen by the widest possible audience. And I think in terms, and we've touched on it here, haven't we, been talking about this ecology, a mixed ecology, I think it's really important that that is a consideration as, if you like, this ecology is shaped going forward. I
think there's another element here that we haven't considered, and I'd like to ask the audience here one question. Does anybody here think that government, of whichever hue it is, has done enough for UK sport since the Second World War? On a show of hands. Anybody? Just leave it there.
Leave it floating. Yeah, question here.
Norman Fletcher, the Professional Golfers Association. I think it's partially a question, partially a comment. I think there are two things. You've just touched on engaging, using the broadcast to engage people in sport. I think one thing that hasn't come back, that the evolution of subscription television has allowed a significant number of rights holders to make significant reinvestment in grassroots in the game, or reinvestments to all levels of their particular sport. So perhaps you could comment on that, because I know it's sports themselves. I mean, we previously only had the voluntary code under the broadcast bill about Class A and Class B sports events. And the second thing, and the one thing that appeals to me as an individual, how much do you think that the evolution of subscription, satellite television, sports broadcasting has caused the free-to-air broadcasters to sharpen their game in terms of presentation and analysis of the particular sport that they're watching?
Bobby, two points there.
2 points.
So go with the second one first.
The
How much has
second
it made
one
you
first.
sharpen your game?
Well, I think it goes back to that whole notion of competition. I think it does. I think it's healthy. I think we've seen that on screen. I think the expectations now of the audience, of rights holders, etc., for the quality of coverage that they demand for their events is on an ever upward trajectory, frankly. So I think if you were to spin back and see how technology has enhanced coverage, etc., yes, competition does make you do that. Of course it does. And, you know, we're probably like anybody else. We're not averse to seeing a technology used here, adapting it, shaping it, taking it forward, and other broadcasters have done the same. So, I mean, I think there's a balance. I don't think an audience, particularly of a free-to-air audience, wants lavish. I think they want quality, they want expertise, they want analysis, they want technology that gives them insight into the sport. And I think we've got some fantastic developments that do so. In many ways, I think sport broadcasting is incredibly blessed for the way coverage has enhanced and grown over, you know, the past 2 decades.
Just to come in on this, I think this is, in fact, also a two-way street. And the paid broadcasters can actually learn from both these guys at times, actually.
What sort of things?
Well, the obvious one is the BBC coverage of the Olympics, and that was completely standout and fantastic. But there are other examples too, of course.
Can I just say, I don't think it's just an innovation of what is done on screen, as in the traditional TV broadcast. I think there has been tremendous innovation in distribution and access. And we're seeing, and I think it's driving the phenomenal reach of how people consume sport, and an awful lot of it is very much in sort of bite size. You know, they're coming for news, reportage, gossip, etc. I mean, and you know, the figures on mobile now are quite extraordinary. 50% of reach of certain sports websites, I suspect it's the same for other websites too, is via mobile. You're seeing alerts, you're seeing an ability of an audience to interact and have a conversation around a major event in a way that I think the richness of experience, not just what's on the screen, but all that goes around it now has been phenomenal.
Niall, can I get you to comment on the gentleman's first point, which was that the sale of rights to subscription broadcasters has enabled certain sports to invest far more? I'm thinking cricket, golf, and so on. You were quite disparaging about the fact that they've lost eyeballs. Do you think that balance of being able to use more of the money actually works for them or not?
Well, I think those figures are very difficult to determine about how much is being invested in grassroots, what is grassroots, and who believes what figures. I was very surprised when the Open went, I have to say, very surprised. But I'd rather answer the second question, which is more about, I don't think in the 90s when Sky came on the scene, either the BBC nor ITV needed a lot of lessons in terms of commentary and presenters. And to this day, I think both companies have got exceptional broadcasters. What they did need a lesson was, I was the editor of Match of the Day from 95 to 2001. Sky putting more and more cameras into sporting venues, sporting arenas, forced the BBC to up its game considerably, because there was a period when I got the editorship of Match of the Day, the main games were covered on 5 cameras, and there was a proposal during a cost-cutting exercise, could we get it down to 4? So when Sky came along, and the range of the coverage and the number of cameras that they put in enhanced the game inordinately, not just in football, laterally other sports. So I think we did have something to learn that aspect.
No, and I would just concur. And I remember being a young producer doing some tennis. I had 3 cameras, and I was asked if I could do it on 2. And I said, which player would you like me to cover? And so I think there was actually a period through which I think the BBC really did take a lot of its resources out of its production, and I think learned a lesson through that. I do believe the audience want a threshold of quality in terms of when an event is brought. And given the competition between different sports, I do think that comes as part of the package. So I think that there too is a acknowledgement, particularly when you are seeing premium sport, that it absolutely demands state-of-the-art coverage as well.
Time for a couple more questions. Lady there.
Hi, I'm Katie Keenan from Celtic Football Club. I have a question just mainly for the BBC. Barbara, I know the charter was sort of written a long time ago, and it does get updated, but with the kind of traffic you're getting online, is there no way the BBC could look at some form of advertising on the online platforms to help bring in revenue?
I think those are all part of the ensuing debate, and there will be many people that would advocate what you have just said. Others might argue that there is a finite amount of resource through advertising, and actually what you'll end up doing is cannibalising from others who rely on that. So again, I think this is a path that's got to be very carefully considered, very carefully trod, because getting the solution right is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for the BBC, but it's incredibly important for other broadcasters as well. And I'll go back to that delicate balance, and actually wanting to keep a balance.
It's another area of competition, is what you're saying.
Yes, it is. It is, absolutely.
You could argue the BBC already takes advertising. Somebody once did a survey of Match of the Day, and it had more sort of sponsors and messages throughout the programme that, you know, it's a form of billboard anyway. But to your point, I think the ITV would have a very strong case against that. And it would destroy what the BBC is. You don't want another commercial broadcaster. The BBC has its own unique qualities, and that should be maintained.
Question here.
Hello, Nicola McKelvey from Performance. You talked about the boat race and how successful that was from the women's boat race. What do the broadcasters feel about their responsibility to broadcasting women-only sports or disabled sports or sports that maybe don't get the coverage that a football sort of tournament would?
So a sense of responsibility, a wider social responsibility. I know what you're going to say, Barbara.
Yes, there
John,
is, absolutely.
have you got a wider social responsibility?
I think we have, yes. And to Claire Balding,
and do you exercise it?
We do. And to Claire Balding, I'm clearly lead presenter on BT Sport, has the same view, and she gets support from our team on this. So you'll find that BT's been supporting the Women's Super League football competition. I'm going to Warrington tomorrow to meet one of the women's football teams that we support from that call centre. So it's not just around I'm showing it on the screen, it's around sort of really trying to build those sports as much as we can, actually, I think. And I think we very much have a role in this. Yeah. I mean, this inclusiveness is very much in BT's DNA. It's part of who we are. So we were the sponsors of the Paralympics, for example, and very much believed in that. And that was a brilliant broadcasting event, of course, too.
I was just going to talk about the women's football, because I think that's a kind of really interesting case where you've got two broadcasters who are working very hard around and in partnership with the FA to really build a momentum. And we saw it at the London 2012 Olympics, 80,000 packed Wembley to watch the women's final, 3.3 million on television. I mean, a really iconic moment. That was a springboard, if you like, for the coverage of the European Women's Championships in 2013. Biggest investment ever by BBC in a major women's tournament. And interestingly, a Trails campaign, specifically done to focus on the skills of the players. 75% of the UK population saw that Trails campaign. So a real sense to try and invest. Obviously, we've got the Women's World Cup this summer. And again, even further investment with every match available. I think 22 of the matches are going to be on network television. But it's not only that. There was a moment I thought was really interesting because a lot of broadcasters say, yeah, but it's fantastic, but we've got to have atmosphere, we've got to have full stadia. And there's no question that imagine the Women's Super League with full stadia. What a difference that would make. Was that fantastic match at Wembley against Germany, 45,000. I mean, and that was a concerted effort over time to make that a real sense of occasion. And I do think that rights holders and broadcasters working together can make a difference. So there is a public service responsibility to women's sport, but we've got to be more ambitious than that. We want women's sport as part of our output on merit. Simple as that.
It becomes an event, though, when television covers it, doesn't it? People want to be there because the TV tells them to be there.
I mean, isn't it interesting? Because I remember debates years ago about, well, if you show it on television, nobody will go. Actually, I think it's the very reverse. The ability to create an occasion. So I do think there is a role for broadcasters working hand in hand. But you know what? We've got to take the public with us as well. Because actually, in this day and age, if you start putting things on screen that people don't want to watch, they just turn off.
Can I, taking on from that point, something that was said yesterday was that what appeals to sponsors, what appeals to broadcasters as well, and they were referring to the Premier League, was not the competitiveness of the Premier League, it was the star names within it. And to a degree, Niall, you just alluded to that as well when you said that the biggest audience you got for Champions League last year was Manchester United against Real Madrid. It can't have been last year. 2 years ago was Manchester United against Real Madrid. So isn't that the heart of the problem that competition delivers, is that we all end up chasing star names?
Well, I think there's differences between the two competitions. The best footballers in the world are not playing in the Premier League. You know, Lionel Messi plays his trade with Barcelona. So the Manchester United versus Real Madrid game does have a lot of star names and is a different model. I think the attraction of the Premier League is about, why do I want to buy a subscription to the Premier League? Because I'll get to see my team on a fairly regular basis. Maybe not week in, week out with the clubs slightly further down the league. But that's the attraction rather than star names per se. I think you buy that subscription because you're going to see your team. John?
I think the Premier League is successful because it has great stories, and I mean the point there about the Spanish league, the Premier League is more open than that at the top, but the Premier League's hugely exciting at the bottom as well, and the relegation contests are massively important for fans, clearly, because it completely determines the fortunes of those clubs. So that level of drama, I think, is kind of unparalleled, really. And the way the Premier League kind of works in this country, it hugely benefits from having the paid broadcasters really getting behind it, of course. I think it also benefits massively from Match of the Day and from free-to-air too, because the Premier League is part of the nation's conversation. I mean, it's just something that you have to know about because people talk about it everywhere.
But Barbara, doesn't this underline everything that we've been talking about? You know, the gentleman from the Scottish FA talking about Scottish football, the lady over there talking about women's sport. Ultimately, what the TV viewer wants is stars.
I think it's a more sophisticated audience than that. There is no question that stars add an extra dimension. So you could probably look back. I mean, take Wimbledon. Andy Murray, 17 million. Unbelievable, fantastic. You know, that final game, you know, all of the drama. Yes, 17 million. Last year, no Andy Murray, 10 million. So yes, there's a big difference, but you know what? 10 million's a damned good audience. It'll probably be, what, one of the top 10 in the UK of the year. So, I mean, I know they were still star names, of course, but I think actually there is an appetite in the UK for just great sport to be played at the highest level. And sometimes that will involve established stars, and sometimes that will involve people coming through. I mean, I think what's interesting is something like an Olympics. If you look at some of the stars of 2012, and you were to look back a few months before they entered that amazing stage, they were pretty much unknown. So I do think the television also has the ability to create those stars, and incredibly quickly. Suddenly people are sort of catapulted up to almost extraordinary heights. So yes, star names are key, they're an essential part of the business. But I think there is an audience that has a love of elite top quality sport and all the richness and drama and contest that brings.
One last question. Yep, don't move back.
Nick Meacham, Sports Pro. How long until we see e-gaming taking prominence on either terrestrial or pay TV?
E-gaming?
No, not too long.
So you'll have on telly someone playing a computer game? You see that happening?
I absolutely see that happening.
Goodness me. John?
It's already happening outside the UK, as Barbara said. It's actually a large sport outside the UK, so I think that Niall's right.
Is it a sport, Barbara?
Oh. It's skillful. It's you know, fascinating. You've got people who, you know, are incredibly capable, and you've got people, I think, who can identify with that capability. I'm not sure it's not a pure sport.
Would you broadcast it?
I think it's something that all broadcasters are going to have to be aware of, and because the fact is, if that's where the audience interest is, it's part of serving the audience. So the shape, the form of that, you know, is maybe to be debated and discussed. But will broadcasters show esports? Yes, I think they will.
That's the future. Thank you very much indeed to our panel. Barbara Slater from the BBC, John Petter from BT, and Niall Sloan from ITV. I think they've given us a great morning. Thank you very much indeed.